Hello, and thank you for joining us here on the Neutral Zone. I am Phil Milani, joined as always by my trusty sidekick, my partner in crime. Really, the best way to describe this person is my everything. It's at Eric Dalala.
Phil, good to see you. It's been a while.
It has been a while, yes. We do these about once a week, though, Eric, so you should be pretty used to this routine.
Well, I'm used to in season, Phil, seeing you twice a week, and so once a week is just difficult to kind of cope with.
That's true. Eric, of course, it's also way less than we'd be seeing each other if we were both at the Combine, which is where we should have been this week. But, of course, no Combine due to COVID-19. No shrimp cocktail for you either.
No, that's true. Kind of a disappointment, but better safe than sorry, Phil.
That is true. That is true. We've got a great show, though, still in store. We're going to, Eric, there's a lot of trade rumors going around the NFL right now, and some proposed suggested trades that could be good, maybe for a certain quarterback, Eric, that's out there. And it got us wondering, who are some Broncos that you think might be untradeable? Is there a player on this roster that you say, no matter what, we're not trading him? So we'll rank our players. Hey, this guy is the least tradable, and maybe we'll name like 3 or 5 guys that we think
not
the
4.
least.
We will not name 4.
Maybe we won't need 4, Eric. Maybe 3 is probably the best, just in terms of this guy's the most untouchable Broncos player.
Yeah, I said we won't name 4. We need 4, Phil. You need more than 4.
But I'm saying, do you think there are 4 guys on this team that are in that category?
Well, I would almost argue that there's nobody, depending on who you're trying to trade for.
Ooh.
Some people have said Deshaun Watson.
Many people are saying this.
Many people.
Yeah.
Not us, but many people.
So
in that category, I'm not sure there's anybody, but it's more of it's a scale. Who is the most untradeable? Who would you least want to part with?
Yeah. If this guy was traded, you'd be like, no. That's how I think about it.
Yeah.
That's how I think about it. Then, of course, Eric, free agency will be here before we know it. 3 weeks from now, March 17th, the official start of free agency. And it got me thinking, okay, there's a few positions of need for the Broncos that they most likely will address in some way, some fashion this offseason. So we'll name the position and then we'll say free agency or draft. Which way is the better avenue to address a position of need? So a little fun game there. It's a game, Eric.
Everything's just a game to you, Phil.
Yeah, it is. And of course, we'll have shout outs and we'll wrap up the show. So that's where we're at.
Who's the interview?
No interview this week, Eric.
Oh,
no interview.
Got it.
I
think I did it last week, so wasn't it your turn?
Oh, is that how we're doing it? Because I don't know what happened the previous 17 weeks.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, Eric, last week on the show, we dived into our favorite football movies. That's what we talked about last week. The fan response on YouTube has been overwhelming. A lot of people siding with yours truly, Eric. Good
for you.
Nordic 5280 says, Phil knows what's up. Remember the Titans is hands down the best football movie of all time. I don't know, Eric. I don't know what you think about these things. Jeff Flanagan, one of our favorites on the show, he says, Jerry Maguire is not a football movie. The story would remain largely the same regardless of outcome of the game shown in the film. I was trying to apply Eric's logic to some other movie, but I was outdone by, and he's calling me Malonia. I'm not sure why he calls me Malonia, but I guess I could get on board with that, Eric. But he says, I was outdone by Malonia's reference to Batman. Well done. Thank you, Mr. Flanagan. I appreciate that.
Phil, I think this is probably the portion of the discussion where instead of just complimenting you, I'll take something that you did well and instead turn it around to put you down and make you feel bad about yourself. If that's okay.
Go ahead. I'd like to see that kind of dancing.
Yeah. I would just say it seems fitting that the thing people finally agree with you on is like movies and which ones you like, and when it comes to real football knowledge, they agree with me. So I'm okay with that. Maybe like you could share your favorite snack too, and people could agree with you there. Or like,
that did hurt my feelings. I'll say that. Yes, I do feel. Eric, this guy's account, his name's error192837465.
Sounds like a real person.
It really does. He says these guys hate each other so much it's funny, and then a bunch of crying emojis. What do you think about that?
Hey, as long as it's funny.
Then Desmond Ray chimes in and says, I don't think they hate each other. I don't think they work good together. That's it. Wow.
Whoa. That's a little much. Who was that guy?
That's Desmond Ray who commented.
926487.
Yep, you got it. Yep, you got it.
All right, Desmond Ray.
We got one final comment here, Eric, and this is from Jabbar Sins, which I believe that we've given him a shout out before. He says, great show today. Fantastic interview. That's weird.
Sorry. You'll be hearing one of those today.
He says, I love the access to players. We'll work on trying to get some more players, Jabbar. I'm trying to. The problem is this is typically their time where they can just kind of chill out for a little bit. So I try not to bother them. But, for NZ Nation, we got to do it.
Well, and to be fair, I don't answer your phone calls half the time. So why is a player expected to do that?
That's true. That is true. Yeah. He says, if you invite Garrett Bowles on, I'd like to ask him if he has any advice for Drew. I assume he means Drew Lock, on how to shut out the noise and have your best season. That's an interesting question. What do you think about that, Eric?
Which Drew would he have been referring to?
Drew Lock. That's what I'm saying.
You said I assume.
Well,
is there another option?
I don't know. Is there another? Maybe he's talking about Drew Beck, Andrew Beck.
Got it. It's interesting.
Have you ever thought about that? Because Garrett Bowles had been facing some music.
Yeah, I think there's something to that maybe he could say, hey, Drew, I worked through this. I do think part of Garrett's struggles, Phil, were due to the fact that his coaching changed every year, which certainly you can apply to Drew. But one big difference is that Garrett didn't play a lot of football, really, before he got to the NFL, started late in life. And so he was still kind of learning on the job. He had a lot of raw potential, but I think honing the technique was important. Whereas Drew has played a lot of football, not necessarily at the NFL level yet, but he played a ton of games in college.
He has, but similar to Garrett Bowles, fundamentals sometimes are lacking, just with footwork and delivery of the football. There are a lot of similarities other than just, like you mentioned, football life from beginning to end. Not the same, but similarly to Garrett Bowles, facing a lot of outside noise, fundamentals break down a little bit. I think the thing that with Bowles that was plaguing him was that he played at a high level, but he had a lot of penalties. So that's not really Drew Lock.
Well, but you could argue that Drew's has made some good plays and played at a high level. His equivalent of penalties is throwing interceptions, and that's kind of plagued him. And if he could cut that down, he would be a much more successful player. Now, I do think that the noise, Garrett Bowles faced that noise, and there's a little bit of talk of competition there before Jawan James opted out. Elijah Wilkinson went over. I personally I think Garrett Bowles had the talent that he was going to win that job regardless. So it was never quite like Bowles is going to get replaced here. Whereas it does feel like the Broncos are doing some serious evaluation about what they want to do at the quarterback position. And so to me, Bowles maybe had a little more wiggle room to figure things out. I'm not sure if Drew Lock will get that same luxury here in year 3 for him, like Bowles did in year 4.
Little more spotlight on the quarterback position, so
Yes,
might not have that, but would be interesting to
but
see if we got Bowles on. We could ask him that.
Yeah, if Drew made a turnaround like Garrett Bowles, I think everyone would be thrilled.
Yes, if Drew Lock played at an All-Pro level next year, I think that we would take that.
Yes.
Second team All-Pro though, right?
Yeah.
All-Pro though.
So not Hall of Fame, but good, still good.
All right, Eric, let's dive in here to our first topic for today's show, ranking the least tradable in terms of you wouldn't want to see them go. Let's rank them in maybe 1 through 3, Eric.
Let's do 5.
You want to do 5? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, do you want to alternate?
We can alternate, yeah. So you're going to name the player that you think they shouldn't trade this guy if they could avoid it.
Right. And to be clear, we're talking about this in some ways in the context of Deshaun Watson. We've heard that the Texans might want some players, but anybody, if Russell Wilson, whoever it might be, you're probably going to need to trade a big name player. And so to be clear, if the Texans call up and say, we want any one of these 5 guys, and that's all we want, maybe we want a first round pick, you got to think about it. But this is who would you least want to trade? I think the guy at the top of that list, Phil, is Courtland Sutton.
I think that's a good place to start.
I think Courtland has, based on the potential he showed in his second year, I think he has all the ability to be definitely a top 10 wide receiver. And I think as he continues to grow, push toward that top 5 range, hopefully. I think he has that potential given his athleticism, his body type. He should be a perennial Pro Bowler, I would hope. And I think that it's not ridiculous to say within a few years you could be talking about it, him as a Demaryius Thomas or Emmanuel Sanders-esque receiver. So he is the most proven offensive player on your roster. I think you got to keep him.
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably Melvin Gordon is more proven than he is, but yeah, I think that Sutton is a good place to start. I would say Jerry Jeudy is my least tradable guy. Obviously, had some drop problems last year, but I think that Jeudy already is one of the best route runners in the NFL, which is, it seems like that's very difficult to teach, the nuance of just getting open. And that is something that comes very naturally to him. I think that if he cleans up his drops, that he's going to take a massive leap. And, if you go back and watch some of his highlights and some of his best routes from last season, a lot of times the ball wasn't delivered right in rhythm. It wasn't like he caught the ball at full speed that often. When he did do it, you saw what he did against the Raiders, where he caught that pass just over the middle there and took it to the house. I do think that Courtland Sutton is really talented, but his major talent is being able to high point the ball, and he catches everything that comes his way. So I do think that Sutton makes a lot of sense, but I do think that Jeudy possesses an innate ability that is really difficult to find. And on top of that, I would say Sutton is heading into his 4th season in the NFL. Contract-wise, things are going to start coming up for him where the Broncos need to make some decisions. So if they wanted to make a move with a high-profile guy, you could maybe understand contract-wise, Jeudy would be the player that you'd want to protect a little bit more.
I think that's fair. I would say Courtland Sutton has proven that he can do it at a Pro Bowl type level. He's put together, I think, an 1,100-yard season. He had, I think, 6 or 7 touchdowns his second year. He's made the plays. We've seen the potential from Jerry Jeudy, and I don't think there's any doubt that he can be really, really good. And your point about the rookie contract is well taken. But so I think a lot about what excites you about Jerry Jeudy is the plays that he could have made, not necessarily the plays that he did make. And certainly he made some, but he had 3 touchdown catches. I don't think that that's enough for a guy that you want to hopefully develop into a 1A or 1B receiver for your team. There were, Drew and Jerry were not on the same page for much of the year, but some of that, I don't know if it's quite 50%. A portion of that it was on Jerry in terms of, he probably has 150 yards in that second Chargers game, if not for the drops, and certainly a couple of touchdowns in that game as well. So I just think when you're thinking about who do you want to keep for sure, yeah, Cortland's contract is coming up, but I know what I'm going to get from Cortland. I know what the baseline is from Cortland Sutton. I still don't know what the peak might be for Jeudy and if he can get there. And I really hope he does. I think he will. But to me, I think Cortland's a little bit of a safer bet there.
You do have to do a little bit of projecting with Jeudy, no doubt about it. But I think that having seen him go through practices, having been around the guy, it's easier to make a projection. It's not like you're talking about a free agent or a draft prospect where you haven't been around him. You haven't been in the meeting rooms with him. You haven't seen his personality. I think that it's easier to forecast what Judy's going to look like here. And it is a big deal to me that Judy's going to be playing on his rookie contract if he lives up to his potential for 4 more years. Sutton is heading into the last year of his rookie deal. So I think that when you're a team looking to make a trade with the Broncos, that's something you're going to consider. So to me, that would put Jeudy just a notch above Sutton.
Sure. So is Sutton your number 2 then?
I would say Sutton is my number 2 player where I would not trade him. And a lot of the same reasons that you just listed off there, just because he is a dynamic playmaker where he can make catches that he's not supposed to make. You know what I mean? I think back to Drew Lock's first touchdown pass where he just dove and caught that ball one-handed in the end zone. There's not a ton of guys in the league that can make a play like that. And even more than that, I think back to that Vikings game in 2019 where he was the biggest playmaker. He's the biggest threat on offense heading into that game. And the Vikings tried everything to stop him. They just couldn't do it. He was catching balls all over Xavier Rhodes in that game. And, Xavier Rhodes is a talented cornerback, and Sutton was still making the plays. And like you mentioned, a Pro Bowl kind of guy. And on top of that, personality-wise, he's the kind of guy that I want in my locker room. He's a leader. He knows when to speak up and make his presence felt. And I think that those are a lot of the reasons why I would put Sutton number 2.
So you've got 2 receivers at the top. Judy's a little bit lower on my list, Phil.
Okay.
He is not number 2. And the guys at 2 and 3 here are very, very close. Current contract status really is why this guy is going to be number 2. Garrett Bowles is my second least tradable player. You've got him locked in now for 4 more years. He was borderline dominant at times, did not allow a sack last season, second team All-Pro. Still probably has another good 5, 6, 7 years left. He's a really good player. And Phil, I think we know, based on how much the Broncos have struggled to find a right tackle, just how difficult it is to find those bookend pieces. I think if you want this offense to go, you have to be able to run the ball. You have to be able to have time to throw it. With Garrett, Dalton Reisner, Lloyd Cushenberry, you've got options over there with Graham Glasgow. Netani Muti is a good backup. You still got to figure out what to do at right tackle. But this offensive line is kind of it's in a nice place. And I think getting rid of Garrett Bowles would disrupt it a lot, to the point that I think you've got to keep a player like that who developed. And I get that it was just 1 season and that a lot of that is banking that's going to continue. But I think based on what we saw that it should. And the other thing, Phil, Garrett Bowles, he's available all the time. He's missed 1 game in his career, and it was due to like a weird food poisoning outbreak. So to me, he's a guy you got to keep on your team.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt about it. Left tackle makes a lot of sense. It's really difficult to find a really good left tackle. It's something the Broncos had been searching for a long time, even when pretty much after Ryan Clady decided to hang it up, the Broncos, that's been a sort of a position where they've tried to find that next solid piece there. And Bowles is starting to live up to that first round potential. And I think that makes sense. That makes sense.
I mean, plus you got to think how many guys on the Broncos roster right now are top 3, top 5 at their position. I mean, I think you could argue that Justin Simmons is that guy, and I think you could argue that Garrett Bowles is that guy, and that's probably it in terms of that level of play. You know, Bowles was a second team All Pro. I think the only guy who was the starting left tackle there, Bakhtiari, I believe.
I believe so. Yeah. CU buff. A CU buff there.
Yeah, the Green Bay Packer, of course. So that speaks to how well he played. I think even at safety, Phil, that there's probably 3 or 4 guys that, you know, a Tyrann Mathieu, for example, that probably is a little bit playing at a little bit higher level than Justin. But yeah, so that's kind of shocking that Garrett could go from, you got to get rid of this guy, he's got to be gone, bench him, to now he's I don't know where you have him, but certainly a top 5 player on the roster, I would think.
My number 3 would be Bradley Chubb, I think.
Okay.
Having a proven edge rusher is probably a top 3 most important position to have, I think, in today's NFL. You saw it in the Super Bowl, Eric, where you've got to get pressure on Patrick Mahomes. I think that having a guy like Bradley Chubb, who strong leadership, high character guy, and then on top of that, his play on the field. It's hard to find somebody who has that build, has that kind of motor, has that kind of get off, that's going to be able to get after the quarterback. And he's a guy with strong work ethic. I mean, he made the Pro Bowl his first year back from an ACL tear. I think that speaks to a lot of different things about Bradley Chubb. I think that lets you know that he's a hard worker, that he's consistent, that he's going to be in there every day. And I just think that position is really, really valuable. And I could see if a team is making a call to the Broncos, I could really easily see them being like, we want Bradley Chubb. And he's a guy that for the Broncos, that would be a tough pill to swallow if you had to give him up.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt Bradley's a great guy. He has, I think, potential to be a top 5 rusher in the league, top 10 for sure. I don't know if we've seen yet, and it's hard, Phil, because we've only seen his rookie season and then kind of a rehab affected season in 2020. But I don't know if we've seen like defensive player of the year potential the same way we saw with Vaughn at points. So that's the only reason to me he's not at number 3 for me. He's a little bit lower, just because I do think that you still maybe want a little bit more from the 5th overall pick. And I think he has the potential. I think he could come back and have a 10, 15 sack season in 2021. But to me, just kind of like Jerry Jeudy, wanting to see that potential realized. I'm kind of going with proven commodities here. I will say, Phil, one reason that he becomes more valuable and you want to trade him less is if the team chooses not to exercise Von Miller's option or Von Miller doesn't return, you're really kind of stuck if you give up Bradley Chubb as well, because then all of a sudden you don't have, you have Malik Reed who played really well, but you don't have a proven blue chip type player. So that is something to consider. Justin Simmons, though, number 3 for me. I think back-to-back years of at least 4 interceptions, makes a lot of plays. This year in particular, Phil, I thought he started to show that he could make game-changing plays, saved the game against Miami, for example, nearly helped bring them back against Pittsburgh in week 2. He's a really good player. It's going to cost a lot of money, it sounds like, at his position to lock up, but he's worth it. You got to keep a guy like that. And so to me, if somebody comes calling and they're saying, hey, we are going to take Justin or we're going to take Bradley Chubb, I feel better about being able to go in with your 1st round pick or your 2nd round pick and say, hey, let's get an edge rusher there at 9 and let's do that. Or let's go sign, let's trade. I guess you might not have the 9th pick depending on what the trade is, but let's go sign a Bud Dupree, for example, for $10 million this year, and then let's see what happens. That to me is more palatable than giving up a guy like Justin that can, if it's going to be a new secondary, most likely he's a guy that can bring them together. I think a guy that you got to keep as a leader of your defense.
In this situation, Eric, what is his contract? I mean, what's going on with him in this trade scenario?
Well, currently, obviously, he doesn't have a contract. I think he's he's third and not second because of that. To me, that's not resolved. I would think that if he's a guy that you really don't want to trade, that contract is going to get done. So, I think you could argue, hey, if that contract's not done, if he's playing on the franchise tag again, then he drops down a few spots. But in this scenario where I'm putting him at 3, I'm assuming a long-term deal can be agreed to by July.
So you're saying, like, if a team picked up the phone today, I mean, I guess, are you saying he's already signed this deal in like this hypothetical, or are you saying that?
No. I just think that if someone picks up the phone today, I think that you want to keep Justin because you believe you can work a deal out with him by July.
Got it.
Now, if there was a guarantee that there's no way you could do that and he was going to play on the franchise tag this year, then I think it almost becomes the smart thing to involve him in a trade package, because I'm not sure that it is very, very rare for a guy to play on the franchise tag 2 consecutive years. It does happen that a guy gets tagged twice, but very rare that they play twice. And then after that, it's almost an assured situation where he's going to be gone after that. So at that point, you'd have to kind of think of the long-term ramifications. But as it stands today, I would hope that people are optimistic that can get done. And I would rather keep him in Denver.
Yeah. That's sort of like, in my mind, when I think about Justin Simmons, I think that they're going to probably end up placing the franchise tag on him because they don't want him to hit the open market. They don't want him to be a free agent. They'll probably place that tag on because, one, George Payton is still coming in and doing his analysis on the roster, getting to know Justin a little bit. But also, we've talked about this, Eric, that the salary cap has not been set for next season. So they've got to work through these things to just hammer out some of the nitty gritty details. But I think that it's a safe bet that they're going to get something done here. If they don't, I think then instantly Justin becomes a guy that maybe you want to push out, like you just said there. If they do get a deal done, though, I don't think that they're going to look to trade him, and he might go up to the top of the list here in terms of what's going on in this situation. I wasn't sure how to treat Justin in this scenario. So I think that, Eric, I'm leaning at 4 at Noah Fant. I'm thinking, I know that was sort of a surprise because I do think that Alberto showed signs of being a premier tight end, a guy who could eventually become a guy like that. But I think that Noah Fant could really push the echelon of this offense next year in terms of, if Sutton comes back and all these pieces on offense are around, I think that Noah Fant could really take off. I don't think that we've seen the best football from Noah Fant just yet. And so the fact that he has 3 years left on his rookie deal here, assuming they pick up a 5th-year option, I think he becomes an enticing player. And I also think that if you're making this big enough a trade where maybe the opposing team is calling for these types of players, let's just say a Watson, I don't think you want to give up a piece like Noah Fant if you're going to bring in a quarterback like that, because I think that with the right quarterback, the right kind of offense, Noah Fant could be one of the premier players in all of the NFL.
Yeah, Noah's a tough one for me. At 4, I'd probably put Bradley there just because I think the uncertainty with Vaughn makes that position really important, and you need to make sure that you have an edge rusher. And I think even though Bradley hasn't lived up to maybe his own expectations, he's still a really good player and has that potential. So you got to keep him. So that's why I would put him 4th. But Noah's interesting because on the one hand, I do agree with that train of thought that if Noah's gone, can Alberto take a step forward? Can he be the guy that, maybe he's not going to, maybe Alberto doesn't have the same potential as Noah to get to the Darren Waller, Travis Kelce, George Kittle type level, which I do think Noah has that potential. But could Alberto be good enough or like an above average tight end to where if you have him, Sutton, Judy, for example, it's still a dynamic offense. I don't know. I go back and forth because the other argument you can make, Phil, is that Alberto played well last year in his limited time, but it was with Drew Lock, who was his college quarterback. And would another quarterback target Alberto or involve him in the offense the same way? I think that's something that I wonder about a little bit.
And he's coming off of an injury, so there's
Sure.
some doubt
Well,
there.
So is Cortland, and I stuck him at number one. Yeah, it's just Noah. To me, Noah's not in my top five. I think he's a really good player. I think I was expecting a little bit. For me, there are halves. There are quarters where he dominates and where he looks like he can be a top 3-5 tight end in the league. And then there are times when he just doesn't make an impact. And I don't know if that's him, if that's the quarterback, if that's the offensive play calling or what that is, but that they kind of have to figure that out. And then the other thing, Phil, is just about value. I think a wide receiver, I think a left tackle, I think an outside linebacker, those types of positions to me are a little more valuable than tight end.
Well, we're about to see a tight end go in the top 10 this year. And I think that we saw two of the premier tight ends play in the Super Bowl this year. So
right, but
it's an evolving position.
I mean, George Kittle and Travis Kelce are third-round picks.
Yeah, exactly.
So there are ways to find those guys.
I think that in the offenses that have a lot of success nowadays, you're seeing Gronk, you're seeing Kelce, you're seeing Kittle. These offenses are what people are trying to get to. And,
right.
Gronk caught 2 touchdowns in the Super Bowl. So if you can find a player that is open and is a big target, that is a mismatch. When I think of tight ends, I think trying to create mismatches, trying to get them lined up against a linebacker who's not as fast or a safety who's not as big. I think Fant could become that. I agree with you, though, that for whatever reason, it seemed like him and Drew were never quite in sync, or Fant never had quite the impact on games that I thought that maybe he should have had last year.
Right. Well, and in terms of mismatch, Alberto is another big mismatch who runs really fast. His 40 is a split second faster than Noah's. He has that ability to go up and make those catches. And I will say, Gronk did catch 2 touchdowns, but in part he's open because the Buccaneers have Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, 2 really good wide receivers to draw attention away. Obviously, the Chiefs have Tyreek Hill, Mecole Hardman.
That's why I have Judy and Sutton 1 and
2. George Kittle is he doesn't need anybody around him. He's just a different animal. But yeah, 5, Phil. I said I didn't have Noah in my top 5. I have Jerry Jeudy with the 5th selection. I think if we're having this conversation a year from now, Jeudy could easily be number 1. I mean, he has.
He could be number 1 now.
He could be, but he's not. I think that he's got all the potential in the world. I'd just like to see it realized a little bit more, because I do think, maybe I'm wrong, I think if he were to continue his career, if every year of his career were kind of like it was this year, like if he didn't take any step forward and still continued to struggle with drops, I think 3 or 4 years from now, you'd look back and you'd be like, well, that's not quite what we hoped for from the 15th overall pick. And so for Jeudy to be a kind of a successful pick, he's got to make some improvement. So I just like to see that. Before you get to your 5th guy, since it's not a wide receiver, Phil, just curious, if you put those 2 guys on the open market right now and said Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton are both available here to be acquired via trade, who do you think garners more draft capital?
Jerry Jeudy, I think. I think more teams would be interested in trying to pick up a guy like that. But I mean, they're the 2 best weapons in my mind that this offense has. And
very, very different players.
Yes, exactly. I think together with a guy like Fant at tight end, that the offense really should be taking a major step this year. I mean, it just should be. And that's a big reason why a lot of people are like Deshaun Watson. He has the Broncos on his list or whatever the reports are. The reason why is because they have weapons. They've got guys that could easily make this offense really good. We thought we were going to see that last year. It didn't materialize for a lot of different reasons. I think that next year it should be an expectation, especially with all the potential turnover on the defensive side of the ball and the unknowns on what that side of the ball is going to look like. The offense is going to need to start carrying this team and start winning games on that side of the ball.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think the best way to put it into words is that if a trade was made for a top tier quarterback, but you lost Judy or Sutton or Simmons or Bowles, and you could really flip flop Chubb and Judy there. For me, they're very close at 4 and 5. But if you were to lose Sutton or Judy there on offense and acquire a top quarterback, I would have really mixed feelings, because I think we saw in 2019 that Sutton needed more help, and that's why they went and got Jerry Judy. And so if a guy like him were to be traded, it's kind of like, well, why did we do that then? What was the point of going to load up on these weapons? I feel that a little less. If Noah Fant were to be included in a deal, for example, I would be disappointed. I would, of course, want to see him. We've seen him at his best against a team like the Texans where he just dominates. But to me, I'd be like, okay, well, they have a guy in Alberto that's a big physical mismatch. Like, they can still find a way to make this work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why Fant is fourth to me, the fourth guy on there. I do think that if one or two, you lose one of those wide receivers, that's a bigger blow. That's why I have them 1 and 2. If they lose Chubb, I'd be like, that defense is going to be in some serious trouble here, especially if you're talking about losing picks. So that's why I got Chubb 3, Fant 4, and then to me 5. I think I'd probably go Garrett Bowles, just because.
Wow.
I also think that if you want to entice a quarterback to come in, having a guy at left tackle also really important. So I think if you're making one of these big trades, you got to think about, okay, this guy comes in, what's the state of our team going to be like? And I think that one of the most important things is, let me protect this guy. I don't think you can afford to really lose a guy like Bowles. So
you don't think, as it currently stands, that Justin Simmons is a top 5?
I just think that Simmons is I don't know what to make of the situation right now. I don't know if he's like a tradable piece right now. I think that I'm just not sure what's going to happen with him. Like his situation is so up in the air. I just didn't really put him into this. Now, I think there's two things that could happen with Justin. If they franchise tag him again, then I think that he's going to be on the market. I think then you're talking about maybe mid-season, you're like, hey, let me see if anybody's interested in making a Super Bowl run and they need a piece like Justin. Then I think that might happen. If they sign him to a long-term deal, then that's a little bit of a different story. I would say then at that point, he almost becomes untouchable, like where we're not even really having a ranking. He would become that guy who's untouchable. So that's how I sort of think about Justin right now. If they get a long-term deal done with him, I don't think there's any chance that he's moving after that. Even if even if they call, even let's say Deshaun Watson, the Texans call and they were like, we want Simmons. After you've signed him to a long-term deal, I would probably say, I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting, Phil. It kind of speaks to where this roster is. I think if you looked back, certainly at the Super Bowl 50 team, you probably got 4 or 5 guys that were absolutely untradeable, that you were just not touching. If somebody called and said, hey, we want Peyton Manning, or we want Von Miller, or we want Chris Harris, or whoever, like you're Aqib Talib, you're not getting those guys. You're just not. And the fact that, at least I feel like in the current moment, anybody in the right circumstance could be part of a deal. I think it speaks to how George Paton needs to continue to build this roster up, because no team is going to have 10 untradeable players. But I do think you want to get to the point where you've got 3 to 5 guys that it would just take an unbelievable offer for you to even consider moving that guy.
Yeah, and of course, to move a guy, it takes a unique situation when you're talking about players of this caliber. Like it takes a Deshaun Watson to become available, or it takes a disgruntled situation with the player and the Broncos at that point. So I do think that the Broncos roster is in a really healthy spot right now. I think that they could conceivably, if they've got good quarterback play, I think you're feeling pretty good about the offensive side of the ball. If they, obviously, that's the most important position, but I think that when you talk about offseason priorities, if you're not going to get a premier quarterback somehow in the trade market, I think most of the priority is going to be on the defensive side of the ball, signing Justin Simmons to a long-term deal and then filling in some other pieces with high quality value. I think that's where the roster sits right now, if you ask me. And that speaks to how they've drafted the last several years here, where early in the drafts primarily been on the offensive side of the ball. And I think that's how Peyton's spending most of his time right now is, and hopefully he's just about done with this, really assessing where the Broncos are, what pieces he has, what he's dealing with, sort of like if he just sat down to a poker table and they're like, here's your chips. Let me see what I got here before I start, going all in or, wheeling and dealing. So,
yeah. Well, you got to be done because free agency is almost here.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we'll see what happens with that stuff, Eric. But let's get into the next part of the show here where we talk about off-season needs. We'll talk about 5 position groups here and talk about whether or not the Broncos should address those needs with free agency or the draft. We'll talk cornerback, edge rusher, linebacker, quarterback, and running back. So 3 on defense, 2 on offense here. And I think that it's pretty well known that the Broncos are going to have to do something at the cornerback position. So why don't we start there, Eric? Would you try to acquire a number 1 cornerback through the free agent market or draft?
I think it's more likely to get a number 1 guy. And let's be clear, it's just number 1 because I think they're going to have to probably add 2 and maybe 3, depending on what you are looking at. But I think number 1, you got to go through the draft. I just think that it gets very expensive. I'm not sure if the top end options on the free agent market right now are worth what they're going to cost, especially in this reduced salary cap year. Broncos at 9 are at a prime position to get a guy like a Caleb Farley or Patrick Surtain. So I would go that way. Of course, so all this is worth noting. All of this kind of changes if a trade is done before free agency for a big name quarterback. And the other thing is that the Broncos kind of are any team really that engages in that trade are in a really bad spot if that trade happens after free agency. Because if the Broncos decide to say, hey, we're gonna wait to get a corner in the draft, and then all of a sudden you don't have that first pick, now you're in some trouble. So I do think it makes sense to acquire maybe a number 2 or kind of that mid-level guy in free agency that can start, as a proven starter, but maybe isn't a lockdown number 1 guy, so that worst case scenario, you still have some pieces to work with.
So some of the top guys on the free agent market this year, a Richard Sherman, a guy who's in the twilight of his career here, could come in and maybe provide some veteran leadership to a defense. I don't think he'd be interested in the Broncos unless a trade was made for a guy like Watson. Sherman's probably in the position where he's like, I'd like to be that third corner somewhere on a Super Bowl contender. That's probably what he's thinking. Troy Hill from the Rams could be a guy that is desirable on the market. William Jackson III from Cincinnati and Mike Hilton from the Steelers. Those are like some of the bigger names that are available. I'm with you, Eric. I think that if the Broncos stay pat, don't make a big move, keep that number 9 spot, I think that Caleb Farley or a Patrick Surtain make a lot of sense. if they end up moving on from that 9 spot, if they want to trade back maybe in the first round, or if they're thinking early second round, maybe a guy like Greg Newsome, you might know him, huh, Eric?
It's a good
Out of
player. It's a good
Northwestern,
player.
or a J.C. Horn from South Carolina. Those might be players that are like, if they move back because they want some more picks, or if they want to move up in the second. But I think at 9, Eric, they could get any cornerback that they want. They could get the number 1 cornerback on their board. To me, that's really enticing.
Yeah. No, and I think a free agent corner, if it's a Chidobe Awuzie, if it's a Shaquille Griffin, like maybe one of those kind of one step down that makes a Quentin Dunbar, if you decide that there's no lingering off-field issues. Those are all guys that maybe make sense. William Jackson, I think, is considered one of the top options, but he's just, this is going to be a really expensive player to sign. And so I don't know if that's the route you want to go, especially because, Phil, the team is still young. I think if you add a quarterback like a Deshaun Watson, you become a contender. But otherwise, you're still building this team. And so when you think of George Payton saying aggressive but not reckless, the draft being the lifeblood of this team, you need some young players there at cornerback, because whether it's next year or this year, whenever, like Bryce Callahan is going to move on, Kareem Jackson is going to move on. You need some talent there in the secondary. And I like the idea of kind of replenishing it with young guys. So
most definitely. And it's one of the most difficult spots on the field. You're talking about a premier athlete, a top end talent type of person. They don't come around often. So if you have a chance to draft one of those guys, go ahead and take the chance there. And I think that draft makes a lot of sense at the number 9 spot, Eric. Another position that the Broncos might be looking to address this offseason, depending on what happens with Von Miller, is an edge rusher. Eric, would you try to go through the free agency, or would you go through the draft?
Yeah, I think I would go through the free agent market, and probably not somebody on a long-term deal. But I think one of the benefits of this offseason with this salary cap is that you might see some guys do what Shaq Barrett did and sign like a 1-year prove-it deal. And so, I think Pro Football Focus has predicted that like a Bud Dupree would sign a 1-year, $10 million deal somewhere. That could be enticing just because it doesn't seem like, we talk about different draft classes have different strengths. It seems like cornerback is one of the strengths in this year's draft classes. You can get guys for the first few rounds, you can find good depth players late. It doesn't seem like edge rusher, from what I've heard, Phil, is a giant strength in this draft class. There's a couple of guys whose names float around, but nobody that, I don't think even anybody in the kind of Bradley Chubb range of being a potential top 5 pick. And so to me, go to the free agent market, find a temporary solution. Maybe next year you find a guy more permanently in the draft. But I do also think having a veteran to complement Bradley Chubb and Malik Reed makes sense. And you do want to have that veteran leadership. So whether it's a Bud Dupree or somebody of that caliber, to me, that it seems like a good choice.
Obviously, the biggest name that's out on the free agent market right now is J.J. Watt. A lot of people are talking about, where would he go? Don't think he'd be quite a good fit for the Broncos. Bud Dupree coming off of an injury last year, but before that was probably having the best season of his career. So cheaper. Melvin Ingram, the Broncos obviously see him a lot with the Chargers. He could be a nice option, or our good friend Shaq Barrett. But hard to tell. These guys, a lot of them probably aren't going anywhere. Certainly, obviously, Watt is, but some of these other guys could be free, tagged with the franchise tag, or they'll figure out a way to stay where they are. But Bud Dupree would be a nice upgrade there.
Melvin Ingram, Phil, he's a big guy. I went to Vaughn's Pass Rush Summit, and he had me stand and wanted me to be like a dummy for one of the pass rush drills. Easy for me to do, obviously. And
you mean be a dummy?
Yeah. He lightly touched me, and it felt like I had just been destroyed.
professional athlete, Eric.
He's not just a professional. That guy is built like a tank.
Yeah. Jeremiah Tachu is also a free agent, right, Eric?
He is an unrestricted free agent. So regardless of, maybe you add a draft pick in one of the mid to late rounds, or you sign a depth player, or you re-sign a Tachi. But one way or another, Phil, especially if Miller doesn't return, you're going to need to get a couple of guys in there because there are things to like about Derek Tuska, Phil, but I think based on how small or how much bigger he needs to get, I think counting on him to be the third or fourth guy is probably a little much.
Yes. He needs to be hanging out with you on your workout plan.
Exactly. Yeah.
He should stop hitting the Peloton. No more Peloton for Tuska.
Yeah.
Just lifting weights and eating protein. Erica, in the draft, you mentioned not the top edge rush guys. Gregory Rousseau from Miami on Daniel Jeremiah's top 50 board. He's number 13. So not the top guy. Kwity Paye from Michigan is another guy who could be a first round pick. But to me, it makes sense if the Broncos are looking for a guy to come in and just sort of fill a hole and play a lot next year. I think it makes sense to go out in the free agent market and pick up one of these guys just because there's so many of them available this year.
And maybe a guy like Boogie Basham from Wake Forest, maybe he falls to you at your second round pick and you can add a guy like that. But
his last name is Basham.
Yeah. Good.
I want this guy.
Yeah. Pronunciation not guaranteed to be correct, but it's what it looks like.
That's for a defensive player.
Boogie's a cool name.
Yeah. And so is Basham.
Yeah.
Eric, the linebacker position has been talked about a lot, especially with a player like Micah Parsons from Penn State. Could be available at number 9. Do you think the Broncos go free agency or draft here?
Yeah. It feels like they've been close to getting a linebacker here for several years. They found Alexander Johnson and signed him off the street. They had Josie Jewell in the draft. They let go of Todd Davis, obviously. But, yeah, last year in free agency, Phil, we talked about Nick Kwiatkowski, which I barely learned to pronounce then. And then I can't even remember who the other Raiders linebacker was that they signed. They signed both of the top
Singleton
guys.
Was one of the guys, I think, right? He played for the Rams. Is that how
Littleton.
That's
yeah.
That's the other guy. Corey Littleton. Corey, right?
Yeah. So both of the Raiders got both the top linebackers. Then it looked like maybe the Broncos, there were reports that they tried to trade back into the first round last year to get Patrick Queen. So they've tried to do this for a while. Phil, if Micah Parsons, if you could guarantee he was there, I mean, I think he will be there, but if you could guarantee that you could get him and find some good corner help, I would take Parsons. But I just think that you're going to have to take a corner there. I'm pretty sure that the Broncos are almost locked in already to taking a corner. And so to me, you've got to upgrade the linebacker position in some way. So I would go in a free agent market. And if there's one position to maybe spend top dollar on, because you have some cap space, it could be to go after a guy like Matt Milano from Buffalo, who is good in coverage.
Also great last name.
Yeah. Matt Milani. Good in coverage. He struggles a little bit against the run. So I do wonder kind of how much of a fit he is for Vic Fangio's system, because we know that Vic, he doesn't tolerate missed tackles. So that'll be something to watch out for. But he could always be you could put Josie Jewell in on early downs and have Milano kind of be that sub package guy. But I just think it's time to upgrade that spot. You're going to save some money elsewhere on the defense. I'd like to see it spent in the middle of it.
Yeah. They have certainly been looking for that guy. They even drafted Justin Strnad last year with hopes that maybe he could be that safety linebacker hybrid type of player, somebody who could guard a tight end, but also is fast enough to beat a tackle to the edge and make a play in the backfield on a running back. We saw Levante David do that in the Super Bowl. He is a free agent. The Buccaneers might have to have a decision there with Shaq Barrett, Levante David. Maybe one of those guys is going elsewhere. You never know. Matt Milano and Jayon Brown from the Titans another name in free agency the Broncos could go with. Obviously, Micah Parsons is the top guy in the draft, but there might be somebody there where the Broncos can maybe trade back in, like last year. They tried to do that reportedly. Jeremiah Owusu Koramau from Notre Dame. I'm like you, Eric. I don't learn how to pronounce them until they're on the roster.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then Jamin Davis from Kentucky, another guy that the Broncos, maybe if they want to trade in back into the first, or maybe one of those guys falls to them at 9. It's a little bit early to exactly know where some of these guys are going to fall, just because free agency, and also there's still a lot of pro days and visits virtually that could really determine some of these things. So I would say draft if it were up to me. I would say draft there. Because it's not a top priority in my mind. Like Alexander Johnson, Josie Jewell are like they can start in the NFL. They might not be making the biggest plays for you on defense, but they could start. If you draft a guy early, maybe they could come in and provide some competition there, and who knows. So, Eric, what about the running? Oh, sorry.
Well, I will say with the linebacker position, you've got to pay attention to the future a little bit. This is Josie's last year under contract coming up. Alexander Johnson's a restricted free agent. So if you don't agree to a longer term deal to keep him here, then next year he's going to be unrestricted, and you're going to essentially have both your starting linebackers available to walk away. So doesn't mean they couldn't extend either one of them at some point. I think they both have, they probably wouldn't get top dollar, but might have done enough to earn an extension. But that's something to keep in mind, is got to look ahead to, what's coming down the road in 2022 or a little bit beyond that.
We know that Vic really likes Alexander Johnson. He's talked very highly of him in the press. He's also talked highly of Josie Jewell as well. Josie's the guy whose helmet has Vic in it. So he's delivering the play calls and stuff. So you got to be pretty smart there in the middle of the defense. It might be worth trying to keep some of those guys around, especially since they know the defense so well. Eric, what about the running back position? Free agency or draft?
Well, this depends a little bit to me. I think if Melvin Gordon and Phillip Lindsay are both gone, and to be fair, there is a chance of that because Phillip Lindsay is a restricted free agent. I think a second round tender for him is probably too high. That's in the range of probably $2.53 million. I think that's too high. And so then, if you extend an original round tender, it'd be very easy for someone to sign him away. And I do think that that's a possibility because he's shown he can be a starter. He's shown he has Pro Bowl quality talent. So I wonder what will happen with him. And then with Melvin Gordon, obviously he could be facing a suspension to begin next year. And so if the Broncos decide that missing him for 3 games to begin 2021 is too much, if that's just not acceptable, then you could be looking for really 2 running backs, your 1 and number 2 guy. So if that were the case, Phil, I would go free agency and the draft, but let's just say one of them sticks around. In that case, I would go through the draft. I think a late day 2 guy, a day 3 guy. So we've seen that running backs, you can find them in all places. Phillip Lindsay's an undrafted guy. CJ Anderson was undrafted. Of course, Terrell Davis, a 6th round pick. I mean, there are ways to find talented running backs. And I'm not comparing Phillip Lindsay and CJ Anderson to Terrell Davis, to be clear. But there are ways to find those guys late in the draft, and you kind of plug them in. And especially in the recent years in the NFL, we've seen that. So I would not go out and sign another big name free agent running back the way they did with Melvin Gordon. I would not spend a 1st, 2nd, 3rd round, probably even 4th round pick on a guy. I would wait until later stages of day 2, day 3, or I guess day 3 in that case, and go find a guy.
This is an interesting position to me because there's a new general manager. So we're not sure what George Payton's philosophy is on some of these things. We know that in Minnesota, they signed Dalvin Cook to a big deal. Who knows if that was a Payton, if he had any word on that. But if he did, then that might suggest that he likes to have a premier bell cow type of running back. the top guys in the free agent market, Aaron Jones from Green Bay, he had a nice little playoff run. He had more than 1,400 all-purpose yards from scrimmage last year, 11 touchdowns. Eric, he would be a huge addition if they were able to go out and get a guy like that. Some of the other top names, Kenyon Drake, Chris Carson from the Seahawks. Those could be big-time free agent additions. Eric, if they go in the draft, maybe on day 2, Travis Etienne from Clemson or Najee Harris from Alabama could be some of the top. Those are the top 2 running backs pretty much in the draft. Not sure if that would make a ton of sense, Eric, considering the other needs that the team needs. Some holes that they might be bigger priorities, but if they move on from Melvin Gordon, that would create a lot of need there. So,
Yeah,
not sure.
That'll be one of the more interesting positions to watch, I think, just because everyone's focused on quarterback and cornerback, but running back is very uncertain, in part because of free agency, in part because of these off-field issues with Melvin Gordon. One thing I will say, Phil, is that it's never too soon to start thinking about extensions for guys. Courtland Sutton is currently eligible for an extension. He'll be an unrestricted free agent after next year. You just gave Garrett Bowles a bunch of money. You're going to have guys.
Simmons.
Well, I'm talking more, but yes, but like guys on the offensive side of the ball, you're going to have to pay Noah Fant at some point. You're going to have to pay Dalton Reisner at some point. And you can only pay so many guys. And so I wonder if like bringing in a cheaper rookie option is the better move, as opposed to going out and spending however much it costs to sign Aaron Jones and, having a guy like Courtland Sutton or Noah Fant be like, well, does that impact what I'm going to get? Or can you not afford to sign Courtland to the type of deal you want because you've put that sort of investment into the running back position? So just something to keep in mind. I do think that the value of having drafted some good players the last few years is that you're going to start after making some tough decisions.
And you would probably sign a guy like that to like a 2-year deal, or you would structure it so that you had some flexibility on the back end there. So maybe it wouldn't necessarily impact a guy like Fant, but obviously Sutton is going to become a major priority here.
Bradley Chubb, if you decide with Bradley that you want to pick up the 5th-year option, but you also want to negotiate a new deal, or instead of having him, because sometimes they'll do that where you pick up the 5th-year option, but that becomes part of a longer deal. And so it's possible you see both those guys get extended this year.
And you'll also get to know how Peyton feels about Phillip Lindsay, because, Phillip Lindsay, smaller type of running back. Obviously, John Elway liked to bring in somebody like that, an undrafted guy who can provide a boost of speed there, but there's not that relationship with Peyton. So,
right.
It's just something to watch. I would say generally, I'm a bigger fan of going in the draft, just because these types of players, they get hit so often, their body takes a toll. Getting a younger guy in there might make more sense. Last position.
Sorry, just one final thing on that. Like if a guy like a Chris Carson is kind of, if his market doesn't materialize and you decide that gives you a chance, you move it on from Melvin or whatever, you think you can get a veteran like Chris Carson for a good deal on the open market and then add a guy through the draft. That could make sense.
Yeah. Like I would say, you forgot to pay the power, huh?
The podcast has been going on too long.
I see. Oh, that's nice. Are you doing a light dance?
Hope the YouTube commenters enjoy that.
Yeah, that's nice. As Eric goes to turn the lights back on, I was going to say the final position that we'll discuss here is the quarterback position. Eric, a couple of different thoughts here on the quarterback, obviously. If you choose to address the position, to me, it makes sense. Maybe you're talking about a backup if you're talking about addressing the position through free agency or draft, unless you try to move up and draft one of the top guys, or if you go out in free agency. I'm not sure if there's anybody who's going to be available that's going to come in and push Drew Lock out.
Yeah, I think if you draft somebody, it should be to try to go get your long-term starter in the top 10. I think it involves packaging another pick probably to go up there from 9 to 5 or 6. I don't think the cost is anywhere near what it would be to trade for a top quarterback, of course, but you will need to give up something to get up there. So that's one option.
And in that
And I
case,
think you
Eric,
only
you're probably talking what
sorry.
Zach Wilson. You're probably talking about Zach Wilson, Justin Fields, or a Trey Lance, probably.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could trade back maybe and get like a Mac Jones if you believed in him. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't necessarily, um, I wouldn't pick a quarterback like in the third round just for the sake of picking a quarterback. I think Brett Rippon, if he has to be the backup again, that's fine to me. Now, in terms of free agency, I think there's some different options. You could sign a guy like an Andy Dalton or a Ryan Fitzpatrick that makes sense as they come in as the intended backup, and if Drew Lock struggles, then they replace him. Or you could go the route of signing a Mitchell Trubisky or a Jacoby Brissett in free agency, and maybe you have a true quarterback competition in camp between those guys and Lock, and see which way you go. But yeah, I think if I were Drew Lock, I would want the Broncos to kind of find somebody in free agency, because to me, if I'm Drew, that suggests I've got a better chance of holding on to the job in 2021. If they move up and get a guy like, uh, Trey Lance or Justin Fields or Zach Wilson, that means the Drew Lock era is coming to an end sooner or later.
Yes. The way I'm sort of figuring things out here is that in the draft, those guys are going to go pretty high. People are going to trade up and try and take one of these guys. If the Broncos fell in love with one of them, it's going to cost a lot to move up. A guy like Zach Wilson, you're probably talking about the number 2 pick,
Yeah.
So if they really fell in love with one of those guys, then that's what they would have to do. I'm with you. I don't think it makes sense to draft a backup with that in mind. So that takes care of the draft. Free agency, I'm not sure if there's a guy out there that's going to come in and really be that much of an upgrade from Drew. Maybe Cam Newton, if he came in. I think that to me, I would rather just see what Drew can do in a third year. And if you went free agency and went the backup route, to me, that makes a lot of sense. If you could bring in a guy like Andy Dalton, who just played the whole season almost there in Dallas last year, who could come in, he could help Drew out. He can be there if things aren't going quite as expected with Drew, and then you make a decision next offseason. That to me would make a lot of sense. Or of course, if they traded for one of the top guys, those are the options to me. Really, is if you fell in love with a guy in the draft, try to do it. If not, just go try to acquire a backup who could push Drew a little bit. And if they don't do that, I would be fine too, to just see if Drew could get better another year in Pat Shermer's offense. I think that's your hope. And if not, then you have a qualified backup already in-house.
Yeah. Yeah. I think by the end of 2021, one way or another what you've got with Drew Lock. He's either going to take a step forward and you're going to decide, this is if he stays a starter, but he's either going to take a step forward and you're going to decide he's our guy long term, or he doesn't. And at that point, every option is on the table for 2022, trading for a guy, trading up to draft a quarterback, depending on where you finish, signing a veteran in free agency. All those options are on the table. Other point, Phil, I think Denver could be a really, we talk about like JJ Watt may not want to come to Denver. Richard Sherman may not want to come to Denver. If I were a backup quarterback, Denver's a really attractive option because Drew Lock is somewhat vulnerable, it seems. And so if you're a guy like Andy Dalton who still wants to play, you might not come in necessarily to an open competition, but it might get to the point where if things don't go well, you do get to play. So, you could have guys like Mitchell Trubisky, who I'm sure Mitchell wants to have a starting job. Jacoby Brissett probably still wants a starting job. Guys like Dalton and Fitzpatrick are obviously older, but if you're a guy that's looking for a second chance, coming to Denver to battle it out could be an option.
Yeah, you could get in there as a starter some point in the season, or you could even, come in and play a little bit, and with the weapons that are currently available,
Yeah.
it'll make you look good. So I agree with you there, Eric. I do agree with you. So obviously quarterback is a position we're going to pay attention to all off season, no matter what happens. So we'll see what happens there. Eric, let's wrap up the show. You got any shout outs? You got anybody you want to highlight?
Probably Liz Manis could be good.
Of course, Liz
Yeah.
Manis. What do you say we try and be a little bit nice to Ben Swanson?
Yeah, Ben Swanson did a nice 4-part series on Marlon Briscoe, the Magician. I think part 3 drops later today on denverbroncos.com. It's a really nice piece, Phil. I knew some about Marlon Briscoe. I knew he was the first starting black quarterback in professional football in the U.S. I knew that he kind of it was not a great ending to his time in Denver. I knew that he went on to play wide receiver successfully, but I didn't know anywhere near as much information as our friend Ben was able to. It's kind of like a picture book, would you say, where it's a lot of paintings, and then you just kind of imagine
the words.
A picture. Yeah, a painting is worth 1,000 words. So this is probably like a 10,000 word story.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to frame it, I would say. But he did do a nice job there, and learned some new information, of course. And obviously Marlon Briscoe had a ton of talent. He sort of, I wouldn't say like blazed the way for some other minority quarterbacks to come in later, but he definitely was the first. And, I know that Swanson had a chance to talk with Doug Williams, but a nice story on denverbroncos.com that's worth checking out. So I think that he could put away his, feather pen and get back to some real drawing next week.
Yeah. A lot of ink that was used.
Scroll. Like he was like, how do I publish a scroll online?
Exactly.
And we had to scan it.
The little bag that he had that had all the scrolls in the back, though, that was kind of nice.
That was cool. Yeah, that was cool. Hopefully his eyesight's doing okay. He sometimes when you write with a scroll, you need like the bifocals.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Neutral Zone. If you want to be a part of a future episode, there's many ways you can get involved. You could leave a voicemail at 707-NEUTRAL. If it's good, if you're creative, if you've got a good take, we'll play it right on the show. Eric, there's another way too. You could leave an email.
Yeah, I think that's right. You can leave an email at neutralzoneshow@gmail.com.
It's a nice way. If you leave a creative email, we'll read it right here on the air. You can also drop a comment up on YouTube, and we read all of those.
Yeah.
What else can you do on YouTube, Eric?
You can smash that subscribe button.
Yeah, let's go. Smash that subscribe. Or you could just get in contact with us directly on Twitter at Eric Delilah with an A, at Phil Milani with a PH. Very non-traditional spellings. I'll just say that. Sort of strange. But that's the best way to get involved with the show, and maybe you can be a part of the next episode. We'll be back next week, but until then, for Eric Delilah, I am Phil Milani. You've been listening to The Neutral Zone.